At 75, Mabel's body was a tapestry of decades of work, each ache and wrinkle telling a story of relentless sacrifice. Her hands, once soft and delicate, were now calloused from years of labor, the skin slightly rough to the touch. Her back ached constantly, a reminder of the late-night shifts she had endured at KFC, serving strangers with a forced smile while her own body protested. Every evening, she would return home smelling faintly of grease, the scent clinging stubbornly to her hair and clothes, a physical reminder of her tireless efforts. Her life had been a cycle of giving, of placing others' needs above her own. Her children, grown and comfortable in their routines, rarely acknowledged the extent of her sacrifices. Bills were paid, groceries were stocked, and somehow Mabel's relentless labor became invisible, expected, almost taken for granted. That evening was no different. She had worked a double shift, her feet swollen and sore, her arms heavy from lifting trays and cleaning countless tables. Yet, as she stepped through the door, there was no welcome home, no sign of concern for her exhaustion. Her son, Tom, lounged on the couch, casually scrolling through his phone, seemingly oblivious to the physical toll she had endured just hours ago. "Can you?" he started, his voice casual, cutting through the silence of the house like a knife. Mabel froze mid-step. After decades of sacrifice, she realized the words themselves were not the problem. It was the ease with which he asked, the expectation that she would always be available, that her body and energy were theirs to command. She took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of fried chicken mixed with the faint aroma of her own fatigue. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her bag. The apartment was dimly lit, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound besides the occasional distant car horn. She wanted to shout, to make him see the reality of her life, the swollen feet, the sore arms, the relentless days that left her drained. But instead she smiled faintly, masking the storm of emotions inside her. Mabel remembered the nights she cried quietly in her bedroom, hiding under the covers, wishing her children would see her sacrifices, acknowledge her pain. She remembered the meals she had cooked after 12-hour shifts, the laundry folded while her own bones begged for rest, and the countless hours she spent worrying about their happiness and well-being. And now, decades later, she realized that all of it had become expected, taken for granted. As she peeled off her apron and leaned against the counter, she felt a strange mixture of sorrow and determination. Sorrow for the life she had given away, piece by piece, and determination that something had to change. Perhaps it was time to stop being invisible. Perhaps it was time to acknowledge her own needs, to place herself first for once. Mabel glanced at her reflection in the kitchen window. The woman staring back was tired but unbroken. There was a spark in her eyes, a small but fierce glimmer of resolve. She realized that while her body had aged and her muscles ached, her spirit still held a strength that had carried her through every hardship, every moment of neglect, and every act of betrayal. That night, as she finally eased herself into bed, her body heavy and aching, Mabel allowed herself a quiet promise. She would not allow herself to be invisible any longer. She would no longer let her labor be taken for granted. And somewhere deep inside, a small seed of hope took root, a hope that one day, she might reclaim not only her dignity but also the life she had long denied herself. Over the years, Mabel had begun to notice the subtle patterns of ingratitude that surrounded her. It wasn't just small oversights. It was a consistent disregard for her sacrifices, a lack of recognition that cut deeper than words could express. Her son and daughter-in-law had grown accustomed to her ceaseless labor, expecting her to cover their mistakes, pay their bills, and provide for their comfort without question. She had given them decades of her life, yet they treated her dedication as if it were an unchangeable fixture, like the furniture in their home. One evening, as the dim light of the kitchen cast long shadows across the countertops, Mabel found a utility bill, unopened and gathering dust under a pile of mail. The electricity was overdue. Her son, ever forgetful, had forgotten to pay it again. Her chest tightened as she stared at the envelope. She knew what needed to be done, but the sting of betrayal was sharper than she expected. Every dollar she earned, every late night she endured, seemed to vanish into a void of entitlement. "Mom, can you cover dinner again?" her son asked from the living room, his voice casual, almost indifferent. Mabel froze. Her hands were trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. The smell of grease still clung to her clothes from her long shift at KFC. Her legs ached from standing for hours. Yet here he was, asking her to do more, oblivious to the toll she had paid with her body, her time, and her energy. She realized then that this was not a simple oversight. It was a pattern of exploitation. A silent betrayal that had been years in the making. The very people she had devoted her life to were blind to her struggles, blind to the quiet suffering she had endured to ensure their comfort. They saw her sacrifices as a given, as an obligation rather than the acts of love they truly were. Mabel's mind flashed back over decades of service, of meals prepared and cleaned up after, of nights spent scrubbing floors until her hands were raw, of exhaustion she never allowed herself to acknowledge. And now, after all that labor, she was still invisible, still treated as though her tireless giving was merely a background for their lives. Anger bubbled beneath her chest, mingled with the sadness that had grown like a shadow in the corners of her heart. But amid that anger, a quiet clarity emerged. This betrayal, which had once seemed like an unbearable weight, now revealed an opportunity. Perhaps it was time to stop being taken for granted. Perhaps it was time to reclaim her dignity and her life. Mabel thought about the small ways she could change the dynamic. She could begin to assert herself, to stop giving automatically, to prioritize her own needs for once. The thought filled her with a tentative sense of empowerment. She realized that while her body had grown old and weary, her mind remained sharp, capable of outmaneuvering the entitlement of those who had relied on her for far too long. That night, she lay in bed, her body sore, but her mind awake with possibility. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of determination that wasn't just about survival. It was about justice. Not vengeance born of malice, but a measured reclaiming of the life and respect she had long been denied. The betrayal she had endured was real, and it had hurt deeply. But she knew that from this hurt, she could forge something stronger. She would no longer be invisible. She would no longer allow her sacrifices to be dismissed as normal. And somewhere deep inside, the first seeds of her quiet, patient revenge began to take root. Mabel began to notice the power in restraint. For decades, her life had been dictated by the endless demands of her children, their needs taking precedence over her own. She had worked late shifts, cleaned, cooked, and cared for them without complaint. But now, for the first time in 75 years, she realized that she didn't have to. It started with small changes. She cooked less. The dishes sat a little longer in the sink, a quiet rebellion against years of unquestioned labor. She stopped covering for missed payments and unpaid bills, letting her children feel the weight of responsibility that she had carried silently for so long. Their protests were immediate. Pleas, complaints, even subtle threats, but Mabel was unshaken. She had endured far worse. Years of invisible labor, nights spent crying quietly over her exhaustion, decades of unacknowledged sacrifice. This minor disruption in their comfort felt like liberation. For the first time, Mabel allowed herself indulgences she had long denied. A soft throw for her frail back, a cup of tea in her favorite mug, a small chocolate bar eaten in secret while she sat in the quiet of her kitchen. Each act was a small rebellion, a reclamation of the dignity that had been quietly stripped from her over the years. It felt deliciously freeing. The children, accustomed to her unconditional submission, were bewildered. Her son complained openly, frustration evident in every word. "Mom, why won't you help us like you used to?" he demanded one evening, his tone incredulous. Mabel simply smiled, a gentle, knowing curve of her lips that both soothed and unsettled him. "I've spent my life helping," she replied softly. "And now it's time I help myself." The look of shock on his face was almost gratifying. For the first time, he realized that her energy was not infinite, that her labor was not an inexhaustible resource. The revelation hung heavy in the room, as if for years he had been blind to the truth that had always been there. Mabel also began to save secretly. Small amounts of money from her shifts went into a jar tucked away in the back of a closet, out of reach and sight. It was her little nest egg, a tangible symbol of her autonomy. Each coin she added was a quiet act of rebellion, a step toward freedom and independence. She reveled in the subtle changes, the gentle shift of power in her household. She no longer rushed to serve meals, no longer answered every request immediately. She allowed her children to navigate their own chaos, to confront the consequences of their neglect and entitlement. And in the midst of their discomfort, Mabel felt something she had rarely experienced in decades. Control. It wasn't bitter revenge she sought, not in the way of cruelty or punishment. It was quiet, dignified, and deliberate. She had spent a lifetime giving without acknowledgement. Now, she would take back her energy, her time, and her peace. The satisfaction was profound. By the end of the week, her children were noticeably unsettled, their frustration growing with every small denial. Every moment of independence Mabel claimed for herself. Yet she remained serene, watching as the world she had long shaped for them began to wobble under the weight of their own reckoning. For the first time, Mabel felt the exhilarating taste of empowerment, the sweet, patient joy of knowing that years of silent suffering were giving way to justice served quietly but irrevocably. Months passed, and Mabel's quiet rebellion had begun to reshape the household. The subtle changes she had made, the delayed meals, the quiet refusal to cover unpaid bills, the gentle insistence on her own comfort, had unsettled her children more than she could have imagined. Her son, once dismissive and entitled, now approached her with hesitation, as though stepping on fragile ice. One evening he came to her, his eyes red and weary. Bills had piled up, late notices were mounting, and for the first time, he realized that Mabel was not the inexhaustible provider he had always assumed. "Mom, I know I've taken you for granted," he said quietly, almost pleadingly. I need your help. Please." Mabel looked at him, her face calm and serene, her body sore but her spirit unshakable. She remembered every late shift, every aching night, every moment she had sacrificed for their comfort. She remembered the invisible labor that had kept their lives running smoothly while her own went unnoticed. "I worked my whole life to give you comfort," she said softly, her voice steady. "But that ends now. I will not be invisible anymore." Her son's face fell. He had expected her to give, as always, without question. But Mabel's gentle refusal carried the weight of years of unacknowledged sacrifice. She reminded him, not angrily but firmly, of the countless nights she had worked until her arms were sore, the hours she had spent scrubbing and cleaning, the money she had spent quietly to cover his mistakes. She laid bare the truth that he had long ignored. She had endured betrayal after betrayal, and now, she was reclaiming her dignity. The silence that followed was thick with realization. For the first time, her son truly saw her, not as a provider, not as a background figure, but as a woman of strength, courage, and resolve. It was a painful lesson, but a necessary one. With the burden of unacknowledged labor lifted, Mabel turned her attention to herself. She took the money she had been saving in secret over the past months, small coins and bills tucked away like precious jewels, and used it to indulge in the things she had long denied herself. A soft blanket for her aching back, a day at the spa to ease her tired muscles, a small trip to a nearby town she had always dreamed of visiting. Each act was a celebration of her resilience, a tangible reminder that her life was her own. The transformation was not dramatic or vengeful. It was quiet, deliberate, and deeply satisfying. Her home became a space where she was seen, where her needs were recognized, and where her children learned, through their own discomfort, that respect is earned, not assumed. Sitting in her favorite chair, her feet propped up and a warm cup of tea in her hands, Mabel felt a profound sense of peace. She had survived betrayal, endured decades of labor and invisibility, and emerged stronger and wiser. Her revenge was not loud or bitter. It was measured, elegant, and undeniably sweet. It was the revenge of a life well lived, a woman finally prioritizing herself after a lifetime of giving. For the first time in years, Mabel smiled without restraint, feeling the deep satisfaction of justice served not through anger, but through dignity, empowerment, and the quiet reclamation of her own life. The years of sweat, tears, and sacrifice had not been wasted. They had been the foundation of her ultimate triumph. The knowledge that she was no longer invisible, no longer taken for granted, and finally free to live for herself. And as the evening sun cast a golden glow across her living room, Mabel whispered to herself, a gentle but powerful affirmation. "This is my life. I earned it, and no one will ever take it from me again."